Yeehaw! Howdy, y'all. I'm here for lesson 21, intro, first pages. Yeah, I'm going to talk like this the whole video if you want me to. You just got to give me a yeehaw. Oh, I couldn't hear you. So, guess I'm not going to talk like that the whole time, but I am going to go through lesson 21, the first pages, which in your notes book are on pages 192 and 193. So page 192 to 193 in your notes book. So make sure you're open to that. Our learning target for today is to determine relationships among various angle pairs. So pairs meaning two different angles that are created from parallel lines and a transversal. So in order to be successful, and when you are successful today, you will know that parallel lines, first of all, are lines that never cross. So that's something that hopefully you already know. You got to know also that a transversal, which is a vocab word, is a single line that cuts through two or more other lines. So when it cuts through something, it's called a transversal. And the other thing that we're going to go through today, and you really got to know, is the difference between these names of angle pairs: corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, vertical angles, and then also some different types of supplementary angles, including same side interior angles. So let's get started right away. This is on page 192 in your notes. We're going to go through some of these parts, and I'm going to also touch on a couple of them and kind of highlight parts that I really want you to know. So if you look at the very top here, where can you find pairs of angles that are congruent? So remember, we said congruent. We talked about this in the past. Congruent means the same or equal. Okay, we're going to look for congruent angles. Now, you know that vertical angles, and this is something that you've learned in the past, we haven't reviewed it a lot, but vertical angles, which I'll show you in a second picture, formed by two intersecting lines that have the same measure, so they're congruent. So meaning two intersecting lines, here's one, here's another. The two angles that I'm highlighting here are opposite of each other, and they are called vertical angles. They are congruent. Okay? Now, what we're going to look at more in this lesson is looking at parallel lines and seeing what happens when you have something going through them. Now, obviously, if I look at, this could be boards, this could be a shelf, this could be something where we have all these parallel lines. You can see here's parallel line, this is parallel to it, these are parallel to it. So there's multiple vertical angles formed, like these right here with our transversal. I'll put the transversal in red. But like there's a pair of vertical angles because they're created by those two angles that intersect, and they're opposite of each other, and they would be the same. Most of the time, if they look the same, they're going to be the same. But we want to know why. So we're going to take that, and we're going to work with it a little bit. So place congruent strips of paper side by side so that they are parallel. So that's kind of what's drawn there, just made bigger. Use a ruler to draw a line across them, then cut the strips on the line. Where would you expect two angles to overlap? Perfectly. Slide one strip to cover the other as shown on the right and to check your thinking. So what we did is if you have two pieces of paper and you cut through them and then you look at it the other way, you can see right here there's two pieces of paper. So right here. And just like even if you weren't to cut them, you can see on the corners that there are parts where they would intersect and they would be the same. So now if you separate them, you can still tell that angle 1 and 2 in this case are congruent. Okay? When the third line cuts or crosses two or more lines, it's called a transversal. And this is actually one of our vocab words for the unit, so make sure you note this down. Maybe put a box around this. A transversal is when a third line cuts or crosses through two or more lines. And we're going to specifically look at it cutting through parallel lines. Now when the lines are parallel, the transversal forms pairs of congruent angles called corresponding angles. So corresponding angles are angles that are in the same spot. So let's just say we have these three parallel lines back up on our first example. We have the red line, which is the transversal. Angle 1 and 2 are in the same spot, just up one level. Angle 3 is also in the same spot. And you know what? They look all congruent, and they are all congruent. Those are called corresponding angles. Corresponding means they're in the same spot. So there's a keyword for today as well. They're in the same position in the intersections of the transversal and each of the parallel lines. So angles 1, 2, and 3 are corresponding angles. They're above one parallel line in this one. They are all congruent. So that's another big part there. Okay, so corresponding angles are all congruent. They're in the same position. Now, there's these things called alternate interior or alternate exterior angles too. We want to look at those as an angle pair today as well. So you can combine what you know about congruent vertical angles and corresponding angles to find other angles that would be congruent as well. You notice we're using that word congruent a lot. So here's an example. If you look at this, we've got three parallel lines. Here's one, here's two, here's three, and you have a transversal as well. That's the red line that's cutting through them. The transversal cuts through two or more lines. Okay? Now, there's multiple angle pairs that's created by those. Hey, guys. Oops, sorry about that disruption. All right, so back to this example, though. When we have those three lines with the transversal, there are certain angles that you can tell should be congruent. Like, for instance, we know that 5 and 2, those are vertical angles, so those are congruent, just like we know about vertical angles. We also just can look at angles 1, 2, and 3. Those are the corresponding angles that we just talked about above. So those are all congruent as well. But there's other pairs of angles that would be congruent. Like, for instance, angle, let's see, angle 1 and angle 5. And part of that is because we know 5 was congruent to 2, and we know 1 was congruent to 2. So that means that 1 is congruent to 5 as well. So reading this paragraph here, it says because 2 and 5 are vertical angles, 2 is congruent to 5. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 5. Okay? Because angle 1 and angle 2 are corresponding angles, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So that also means that 1 and 5 are congruent. And those are called alternate interior angles. Okay? They're called alternate because they're inside of the two parallel lines. I'll draw those two parallel lines. They're inside, so that's the interior. And they're on alternate sides or opposite sides of the transversal. So they're on opposite sides of that line that cuts through them. So that's why they're called alternate interior angles. Now, we don't have it in here, but there's also another type of angle called alternate exterior. And I'm going to have you note this. Alternate exterior angles are also, exterior angles. And one example of that would be like example 5 and example 3. Or those two angles, angle 5 is congruent to angle 3 because we know angle 5 is congruent to angle 2 and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So 5 and 3 are congruent. Those are called alternate exterior because they're on alternate sides of they're on alternate sides of the transversal and they're on the exterior of those parallel lines. Okay, but those are also congruent. So let's look at one other set of angles that are congruent. These are called same side interior angles. So let's read this through. Adjacent supplementary angles. So meaning supplementary angles that are right next to each other. And I'll draw an example. So there's a line. They're next to each other. And they're supplementary because they make a line. Those are called a linear pair. That's a review term. A linear pair, it's because together they form that one line that goes all the way across. So in the same example, we have angles 2 and angle 4, or 2 and angle 6, it says, are a linear pair because these two angles together make this one line. Okay? So 2 and 6 are called linear pairs. 5 and 6 are also called linear pairs because together they make this line. So the word linear, again, has to do with a line. And those are always 180 degrees if you add them up. That's why they're called supplementary. But if you combine this with stuff that we knew about alternate interior angles to learn we can learn about these things called same side interior angles. So let's look at, for instance, angles 1 and 6. 1 and 6, this one and this one. They're not congruent. You can tell they're different sizes, but we know that 1 and 2 are congruent, and 2 and 6 add up to 180. So since they're congruent, we can switch them around, and since they are also supplementary to each other. So those two add up to 180 degrees. Same side interior, those are the ones that are not congruent. They add up to 180 degrees. Because if I were to take this, let's just say I erased those. Let's just say I take angle 6, draw it out. Now I slide it right down. Now it's right next to angle 1. I drew that a little off, but it's right next to angle 1. And together those two would make a linear pair, just like 2 and 6. 1 and 6 and 2 and 6. So those are also supplementary. All right. Now there's lots of different ways you can say what are congruent, what are supplementary. Here's some more examples. 2 and 5 are vertical angles. Okay? 2 and 5, they're opposite of each other, and they're just formed by two lines that cross. So those are congruent. Okay? How about a pair of corresponding angles? Number 2 here. 1 and 2 are in the same spot, just on two different intersections. They're corresponding. They are the same angles. As long as these are parallel lines, that's true. How about number 3? Angles 1 and 5 are alternate interior. So 1 and 5, here and here. We said alternate interior angles are always the same length or measure, so those are congruent as well. And then number 4, angles 5 and 6 form a linear pair. Okay, talking about linear pairs, those add up to 180 degrees because they make a line together, and a line is 180 degrees. So there's just some additional relationships, things that we know are congruent. I'd like you to come up with more. Let's come up with 3 other pairs of things that you know are congruent or supplementary. So pause it, list a few. All right, so I did list a few here at the bottom. If you're looking at that diagram, I found some vertical angles. 4 and 6 are vertical angles. 2 and 5 are also vertical angles, so they're congruent to each other. Some corresponding angles, 1, 2, and 3, those are all corresponding, so they're all congruent to each other. And 4 and 7 are also in the same spots. Those are congruent to each other. Alternate interior angles, another one we talked about. I got 6 and 7. I think those two angles are congruent, would be congruent. 1 and 5 would be congruent as well. And then I found some same side interior angles. I know we already listed one of those, but 5 and 7, those are on the same side on the interior of the parallel lines, so those are supplementary. They add up to 180. And then the measure of angle 1 and 6 are also supplementary. They add up to 180. So I know that was a lot of different types of angles in one thing. We talked about all these different types. We talked about reviewing some stuff like linear pair as well. But we're going to continue to work with these and finding some congruences and some similarities between different types of angle pairs as we go on. So there you go. That's section 21.1. We'll see you next time.